right, that's right. So welcome. This is another edition of Macedon Cast. I still say the because at the beginning there was the El Macedon podcast, and then there was also the Macedon podcast. So we're going to be talking about that a little bit later today because that's our topic, podcast. All right. So starting a little bit with the history of podcasts. We have to start obviously at the beginning. And that will be when the iPod was invented. A little bit short after, a former MTV BJ, who was called Adam Curry, started recording a daily program, right? Like a diary, you can say that, of what he was doing every day. Thing is, at the beginning, as everything was a little bit slow, not a lot of people were listening, but eventually it catch up, and therefore the podcast was born. Some of the most classical podcasts that are out there, even though a lot of people could make a reference to the Joe Rogan's experience, before that, we had podcasts like Adam Curry, as he was mentioned, the pioneer of podcast, and also besides that, I always have found what the Young Turks did on satellite radio was mostly more inclinated to what a podcast is, because at that time, since a lot of people were not so trusting on satellite radio as they are today, there were not commercials. So the way that they recorded their own panel, it was more inclinated to the format of a podcast. So, even though that there's a lot of people who have been doing podcasts for quite a long time. For example, one good example of that is Mark Maron. You may know him for the guy who was the producer of Robert De Niro's character show on the movie Joker. And for those of you who watched the series Glow on Netflix, he is the guy who is training the girls. I forgot the name right now, but he's also an actor. So, Mark Maron was the first person to ever interview a sitting president. It was Barack Obama. And it was a huge event back then in the podcast world. But you had Joe Rogan already. At that time, Joe Rogan was already running. So the Joe Rogan Experience is one of the, perhaps the most known podcasts in the entire world. But besides that, it is mostly proven that many people that get into podcasts is because they have heard a specific podcast that speaks to them. Either if it is cannabis, wrestling, movies, music, that's how you get into the podcast. Now, usually in the United States, most podcasts could last from 2 to over 3 hours. Heck, I even had some episodes of 5 hours. But that's just the magic of this, The thing is that podcasts have evolved so much that I don't know if it was 2015, but there was this podcast that is called Serial. And it revived an old genre because for many of you, if you didn't know, soap operas and what you binge now on Netflix, it was usually done through the radio. And the thing about podcasts is that it gives you a lot of liberty, You see a lot of people, they swear a lot on their podcasts, and it is due to the nature, on the fact that it is mostly done on a casual nature, So, podcasts in many parts of the world, that's why I tend to cite Joe Rogan. And now, every radio program, when they cut the commercials, they uploaded it as a podcast. So, there's some programs that maybe they are done in that format. Actually, most of the talk programs that are mostly audio only, they are actually being done on the format in which usually podcasts gets done. So when you come and see everything that it is really a vast and immense universe. But it wasn't up until 2015, even though already by that time we had Joe Rogan, we had Mark, we had a lot of people. It was when the Serial podcast came along that it gave a glimpse of what the whole podcast industry can evolve to. It was a really well done. It was done mostly in the format of a documentary, but mostly on audio format documentary. But it was really good on the way that they have kept true to the sounds that they were using, a lot of stuff that they were using at that time. And it was really good narrative. And it shows you that the podcast does not have to be only this casual conversation. It can be way much more. Unfortunately, after that, a lot of people have not explored a lot on it. Just like vaguely concepts, for example, like getting high before the podcast. It has been like the closest thing, unfortunately, since we had that. But I think that is a good example on how huge this is, and sometimes on how we underestimate the power most times of the podcast. Because in the way that a podcast is consumed, a lot of people tend to use podcasts when they commute to their jobs. A lot of people, I even heard of people that like to listen to podcasts when they are on the beach. That they go to the beach basically to listen to podcasts and have the beach as a background, as a visual background. Which is something really amazing, if you ask me. A really good idea. Because you don't want to picture yourself like talking to a lot of people. So when you look at many podcasts, most of the experience is that you saw something on Joe Rogan and then you tend to go to this platform and look for topics that are in interest to you. It's usually a sequence, and it even happened in my case. In my case, I took what was the most popular podcast in Puerto Rico at that time, and I was hooked once again, because when Adam Curry started with the whole iPod thing, and back in the early 2000s, I was interested. I was quite curious, to be honest. And the result of that curiosity, it kind of slept over for a couple of years, and then when I saw it was Chente Idrash, who is a Puerto Rican comedian. He had a podcast that was called El Mazacote. And he was breaking through in a really good way. He was getting really good interviews, really good guests. Mostly celebrities from Puerto Rico, right? But the thing is that he was breaking a lot of ground, because besides that, he had like small comedy sketches in which he will go to places and try to piss people off or do a lot of stuff. So the thing is that that was the thing that interested me. And Chente is a friend, so I started speaking with him. I started chatting with him, and I was telling him I've been always curious about this. But the thing is about me is that I'm really a prick when it comes to sound equipment. If I'm going to do something, I want to do it in a really good way. So I was really picky about it at the beginning. So Chente is the one that tells me, do not waste your time. Like, just do it. Like the Nike slogan. Just do it. He was like Shia LaBeouf at that time. And when he did that, I downloaded an application that is known as Spreaker. It's still my platform up to this day, which is currently owned by iHeartRadio. So When Shinta and I started talking, it was like, I don't know, I need microphones, I need a lot of equipment. No, you can do it from your cell phone. I started doing it in that way. And the good thing, that is one of the things that surprised me the most. Because I've been in the entertainment industry for around 20 years now. And even in the film industry, in which there's a lot of jobs in that industry, there's a lot of jealousy. So, in a way to be inside, you have to earn your ranks, right? It's like normal. It's like high school, most entertainment genres. So, when it comes to podcasts, it is really not quite, but really different. Because at that time, remember, once again, I'm talking to the guy who's breaking through with the podcast on Puerto Rico at that time. So, what you expect is that person is not going to tell you should do a podcast because he will want to take that for himself. That's my experience on over 20 years in the entertainment industry, right? So, in Shinta's case, it was, he was like, do it, you know? We need more podcasts. We need to open and create a market for this. And that's the general attitude here. Because since it is a new form of media, the good thing about it is that it has not been like way overtouched by mainstream media. So there's some liberties that comes as you're making a podcast. But there's also like really well produced but well-mannered podcasts in which there's no swearing, there's nothing like that. A good example of that, I always take Talk is Jericho, which is a podcast from actually AEW wrestler Chris Jericho. And the good thing about that podcast is really fun. It is really entertaining. It's really engaging. And they barely swear on that podcast, which is something that is really refreshing. But it's a really professional podcast. You can tell because it is mostly edited, right? So when a figure like Shinta Drash, going back to my story right back here in Puerto Rico, he tells me about it. He tells me just do it. So you say, okay, as the entertainment business is and it is portrayed, that's the last that we hear of him. And it wasn't the case. The thing is, I downloaded that application. I was blessed enough that on the third episode, I sent it to Luis Gonzalez, who was the first person who allowed me to be on a radio station. And I told him I'm doing this project, that it can work whatever you want. And it was the third episode, and I was already on a panel on a radio show on a regular basis. And I started this in quite a crazy time in my life because at that time I was really invested in politics. So I was even running as a congressman for Puerto Rico. So you would say that Shinta would tell me just do it and he went away. But no, he kept monitoring the podcast. And it was something that it was really, really great. And he kept telling me a lot of tips on how to do this. The best way to sound is the less you edit. And that's why I have adopted this like one-shot recording. I don't like to edit. If I would have to stop, I stop the recording and then I go back to where I was. So Shinta kept there. And Luis was really good at getting me in radio. So I was starting to develop all of this. And throughout 2016, well, since I was a candidate, everything shifted to politics, everything. And it is funny because when I started my first podcast, it it was called La Descarga, which is like unloading. That's the English translation, the discharge. So the thing is that I was at this radio station, right? And after we went off the air, they rerun a program that was a sports program that was during the day, and it was also called La Descarga. The thing is that at that time, I wasn't much of a fan of overexposing the Macedon nickname a lot in a way of exploiting it on a marketing basis. But the funny thing is that Chente kept around, and he was the one that told me that the name's Macedon. Exploit that as much as you can. And at that moment, because I was at a crossroads, I was like, I'm in this radio station, and I'm doing a podcast that has the same name as one of the programs in this radio station, and one thing that has no shit to do with the other, right? So what I do is that I name it the El Macedon Podcast. And the peak time of the El Macedon Podcast, it was around the time that I was running as a candidate for Puerto Rican Congress. So it was quite logical that the podcast was gonna be turning out as a political one. Even though in the radio I started as an entertainment panelist, and then I went to politics, and everything turned into politics, and all of the attention that was put on me at that time was around politics. So it felt natural all the time, but I wasn't realizing that eventually that would have become a really huge mistake. So the 2016 elections came and went, and the thing is that I found myself with a podcast that was mainly surrounded on politics. And the thing is that after you run an election, you obviously lose. The last thing that you want to know about is politics. So it was starting in 2017 when it started the journey of trying to get my original podcast out of the political arena, and I did a couple of episodes trying to go in more social, more specific themes, but it wasn't working out. So all of a sudden, when we hit September 2017, Hurricane Maria was on its way. So in the almost 2 weeks, it was really around a month, because there was a lot of activity, the hurricanes around the Caribbean and all of that stuff. So all of a sudden, the podcast was mostly about weather. Believe it or not, it was mostly about weather. And the thing about that is that I started to shift into what was the necessity at that time. And at that time, I was doing the podcast, and I was also doing Facebook Lives. So on the Facebook Lives, what I would have do is that I would say the coordinates of each of the hurricanes that were on the area at that time, and I don't know. I just went on that trip. I'm not a meteorologist, so the thing is that a lot of people actually were waiting on those lives to know updates of what was going on. And there was this particular case in which was a young lady that she was living in a condominium, an apartment. So when she was living in this apartment, what she was asking me is that when the hurricane comes, where I should be inside this apartment. So I'm not an emergency expert. I'm not an expert on buildings or architect or nothing of that nature. So the thing that I did, it was that I started thinking when my father was alive, he lived in a lot of condominiums. So the thing is that I placed myself in an apartment. What would I've done? I don't have any advice. What would be the logical thing to do in an apartment? Obviously, we will not be in living room because living room is always next to the balcony. Balcony is next to the winds. And the rooms, most condominiums, they are built in a way so that you can enjoy the beautiful view. But when a hurricane's coming in, that is not a good thing because it's a big window on the room. So in most apartments, there's in the bathroom, there's no windows. So my most natural thing was to tell this girl so that she and her pets, because she also had dogs, to go to the bathroom. A funny thing about this is that 2 weeks later, an actual architect, was on the news saying this. If you are in an apartment complex, go to the bathroom. And I was like, oh. I just was using logic. I don't want to be, it's a hurricane coming, I don't want to be anywhere near where the windows are, so where would I go? So I went to the bathroom. And that was my advice to her. But a lot of people were tuning in. And for that time, it worked out. I remember that before the hurricane hit Puerto Rico, I was interviewing my good friend Jose Barreto, who works on the telecommunications industry, especially on the big antennas and all of that technology. And we were talking about how was going to be the impact on the mobile, on the way of we communicate overall. And after that, that was the last podcast. Then Maria came, and after Maria did a podcast, I think it was until early 2018, which was a really complicated year for me. Because at that year, it was the year that I lost my father. And at that point, it was on the summer 2018, I started, I wasn't making any episodes. I wasn't doing shit, actually. I was working at that time, but that was about the only thing that I was doing. And it was 2019, I decided to start doing a couple of episodes, and they were working out pretty much fine. Up until and then I started to get a little bit embedded on work, and this has been the history of this podcast. I do a couple of episodes, then shit hits the fan, and then there's no more episodes. We keep making episodes every year, not on a consistent basis as I was advised to do, but we keep doing this. And it was the year 2020 we started doing music podcasts. We have the House of Scotch, and we have Base of Macedon, which is actually now the leading podcast, is the flagship podcast of this whole platform, and it's a podcast that is barely a year old. So in 2019, I found myself really lost on trying to make the podcast more about anything that it wasn't politics. So when we move on to 2020, all of that went out of the window. Because at that time I was like, okay, nothing has worked. And I wouldn't want the last thing that worked, because the most listened podcasts at that time were an episode in which it was dedicated to a real good friend of mine who he was run over on a road, and the others were the ones around Hurricane Maria. So I don't want this to become a disaster podcast. We have a little bit too much of those. So I decided that okay, so my thing is politics. Everybody wants to hear what I have to think about politics. So let's go with politics. It is an election year, so why not? So I started bringing in a good friend of mine, JJ Maldonado, who was helping me out as a panelist because he had a lot of experience. He's a former ACLU member. So he knows his way around the political arena. And I always wanted because the thing is that when I started all of this, I was said I need someone else. And mostly I was thinking about a panel, but the thing is that let me start with one and then I keep building the whole thing. But the first person who I wanted someone who didn't think 100% like me. I wanted someone who had something else to bring into the table, because if I wanted to bring in someone who thinks like me or speaks like me, then I can keep doing this by myself. But the thing is that what JJ brought to the table was really good. So we started going into the election, and when we were going to the election, I started to working on some statistics, and the way I worked about that was to gather information from the elections from 2004 onwards. And like a lot of media does on these days, and you can see it, CNN, NBC, you will see them like indirectly endorsing a Democrat candidate, right? So in my case, I wanted to present an option of difference in Puerto Rico. And even though I have nothing against Juan Dalmau, in fact, they were the only party that I bought merchandise, and I think I donated money to, which is the Puerto Rico Independence Party. And mostly in most elections, they have not done good, but it's not because of them. They have done really good on the areas that they have been elected. But the thing is that a lot of people are afraid of that term because they see themselves in a lot of economic hardship in Puerto Rico, and thinking about that work of independence that we're running from United States, that's a lot of fear that gets into a lot of people without basis, but you know how people are. So I wasn't putting a lot of effort on that because it was more of a traditional structure. So I decided to go with a new emergent party that was going on, and I decided to juice up the numbers. TV stations, radio stations, they all do this. So I decided to use the numbers in the opposition. And the backlash was, to say the pretty much least, it was horrible. I didn't fail so much on the prediction on the governor. The thing is that we went to the streets in 2019 asking for a governor to go, and we ended up electing a governor from that same party. And I thought that was going to have some weight in the election, so I was going into his direct opposite. And the thing is about that guy is that his name is Charlie Delgado. And the thing about Charlie was that he's like this hunky old man and all of that stuff. And I thought this could work. It worked in 2012, so it could work now. He was doing horrible, but like really horrible on the debates. He was getting crushed. But the thing is that in 2016, Ricardo Rosselló was being dragged on the debates, and he ended up winning. So I thought it was going to be the case, but it wasn't, because the actual governor was really clever enough to use the debates to say, I know these people, I can work out with them. And that took a lot of these people who were undecided, and he swooped them to his side automatically. So the thing is, it wasn't until the start of 2021 that I had a couple of personal problems, but besides that, the backlash to the predictions of the election, that was horrible. And obviously, I did not want to do politics anymore. So I was like, to myself, I was like, that's what you get, because you said you didn't want to do this, and then you end up doing it. It's like, what the fuck is wrong with you? You know? And the thing is that starting in 2020, I didn't know what to do. I was really clear on the fact that I wanted to change the topic from politics to actually everything else. And it wasn't until late 2021 that I was on my job that a colleague told me. I was like, man, I got this podcast and I don't want to do the politics team anymore. But the thing is that it is too attached to the name. And he was like, then change the name. And that's what I did, and that's where we are today. Because the thing is that in podcasts, what has they proven to me is that they're really a powerful tool, and they're really really necessary for a lot of stuff. The casual format gives the podcast a lot of humanity. And I think that is something that has been lost a lot of traditional media, and even on outlets like news outlets that they're supposed to be a little bit more human. But the thing is that, for example, an anchor has to be neutral on feelings. So that goes to the point of how important a podcast is. The funny thing is that as I was wrapping 2020 with the whole predictions blunder and everything, I was launching also 2 additional podcasts, but they were mostly concentrated on music. And one of them specifically in a year has done what no other podcast on this platform has done. And it is to break through in a really big way. And that would be the base of Mastodon podcast. It right now, England has not been able to keep away from it, and I'm really thankful for that. But the thing is that when you have a podcast, you have a responsibility. You're a communicator, even if it is a wrestling podcast, an entertainment podcast. You have a responsibility, and this is not a new market anymore. This is a whole industry. In fact, fuck that. This is its own universe. You know, there's so much podcasts. There's narrative podcasts. There's a lot of podcasts about crime. Maybe far too many. But the thing is that people feel connected to the podcast because what they are hearing is another human being. And when you see television, and when you sometimes not a lot on radio, because radio has adopted the podcast format as I was mentioning earlier. But the good thing about this is the fact that you have another opportunity. You have another media. You have something that can be a little bit more yours. Because the good thing is that executives and a lot of people, they don't tamper with this stuff. It's not like the music industry that they will tell you how even a hi-hat should sound. In the case of the podcast industry, at least on what I've learned so far, that does not exist. The podcast producer and the host, they have complete creative freedom to go wherever they want to go. And that is something that it should stay in that way. And it's really something that is really good. So let's hope that it does not get into a Hollywood or the music industry level. But so far the experience has been really amazing, and this is like an open community. You know, it's like, you know, a fellow podcaster. You want to be on their podcast. You want them to be on your podcast, and that's how this works. Because even if we see how humanity has turned out, and we listen, right? The good thing about podcasts is that it gives back to humanity that its own humanity, and it is really something that we should cherish. And I really hope that at least this medium, and the moment I think I'm hoping this is, I think it's happening as well, but that a lot of industries cannot tamper with this product, because a lot of industry, the music industry, has tried a lot of times disguising it with their, even with their artists or someone random, but they have tried. And people who consume podcasts, they're really people who are really true to themselves. And I think that is the reason why malicious corporate intentions have not been able to break through, and let's hope that they don't. And the good thing, there's a real good thing about that. Even though you will hear, because I do not record commercials, that's something that is add on by the platform. So you will be hearing like the podcast up until the half of it, and then you will be hearing like a commercial. Well, the good thing about that is that even though I don't get to choose my commercials at this point, it was at one time there was the pre-roll commercial for the previous podcast. It was like, you gotta have eggs, and in Spanish, eggs are huevos. And huevos, if you traduce it back, are cojones. And it was really something a little bit charming, to say the least. Because it was like, you gotta have cojones. Remember, that's something important. And I cannot stress that enough, because we live in a time in which thinking by yourself sometimes can even get you killed. So that's that for this episode. So remember, that's the value of the podcast and everything. It was heartwarming because opening myself to my own experience as a podcaster is always something that I cherish. So once again, that's that episode. So we will be returning on the month of March. And know that I have said that I would like to keep this space as timeless as I can, but I don't want you to be missing. So in the month of February, we'll take in a small break. The thing is, a funny thing about this is that I always try to make the seasons work from March through June, and then through September to up to the first week of December. The thing is that life happens. I'm a working Steve. I'm making a lot of stuff. I also produce music on 2 musical projects. So it is really quite hard. But I really hope that starting from September, we can be on a regular basis so that we can enjoy ourselves better. So far to this point, this is Marcel Macedon Cruz for Macedon Cast. And I hope you really had a good time.